Welcome Chess Club to another session of remote learning. We have a couple more sessions, and in these last few sessions, as we're winding down Chess Club this year, I want to show you some special games where you can watch how professional chess players played and used some of the tactics and ideas that we have been working on all year. Now, in this particular game that I'm going to show you, I want you to think about a couple of different things. One is how you decide to start your game. One of the things that I like about chess is how creative you can be. You can start by just following the rules like, e4, e5, getting out your knights and bishops. So knight comes out to attack the pawn, knight comes out to defend, you bring out your other knight, and your opponent brings out their other knight. This is the four knights opening. As you know, it's a very symmetrical opening. And then the bishops come out. And then the third thing you need to do is you castle to get your king to safety and to activate the rooks. Okay? Now, a lot of beginners will simply open like this. It's a very symmetrical game, and it's doing all the things you need to do in the opening. You're getting out a center pawn, you're getting out your pieces, and you're getting your king to safety. But just like when you get dressed in the morning to go outside, you don't necessarily want to wear the same clothes every single day. You might have a favorite shirt that you like to wear, but sometimes you might want to wear something different. You might like to wear shorts and a t-shirt, but you might be going to a wedding and your parents say, well, you need to wear something different. Chess is kind of like that. You get to change it up depending on how you feel that day and what your opponent does. So for example, you might have a favorite shirt, you might decide that you really want to wear your favorite t-shirt and shorts and go outside, and it might be snowing, and you might say, maybe I should wear something warmer. So I'm going to show you an opening that is a fun opening to play, and if the opportunity arises where you can play it, it's something you can try. It's what we call a gambit. A gambit we did show last week in the Morphy game, The Smother of Invention, where he gave up a pawn for position, if you remember that game. And we're going to see a similar one. And in the gambit that I'm going to show you today, which is called the Evans Gambit, you're giving up a pawn for position, but it also is a kind of game where instead of attacking directly down and having your pieces symmetrical, the players tend to attack more along some of the diagonals. So the game has a kind of unbalanced, asymmetrical look to it, which is kind of fun to play. The game I'm going to show you has a name. Like, remember, we've talked about the Morphy game, the Night at the Opera, where Paul Morphy plays against the Duke and the Count. And last week we talked about the Smother of Invention. I also taught you the Pony Express, where Derrickson is playing. This next game was a game played in 1852, about 6 years before Paul Morphy played the Night of the Opera. And like that game, which was a casual game, they found each other at the opera and they just played, this also was a casual game by two very accomplished players. The white pieces were played by a chess player named Adolf Anderssen, and the black pieces were played by a man named Jean Dufresne. This game is called the Evergreen Game. At the time, Anderssen was considered the best chess player in the world. There was no official world champion, but by common consent, Anderssen was considered the best player before Paul Morphy came on the scene. And so he plays this game, and this game is called the Evergreen Game because, like a tree that is evergreen and its branches stay forever young, forever green, this game is considered so beautiful that it'll be forever young, a kind of an immortal game that everybody will always remember. So I hope you enjoy this game. In this game, I want you to look for the same things that we looked for before. Watch how white will line up their pieces and use tactics like discover check and double check in order to launch their attack. Okay? So, like in many games you saw, it starts off with e4, e5. That is very familiar to you. Moving a center pawn, releasing the queen and the bishop along the diagonals. Knights come out next. Knight comes out and attacks the center pawn, and black defends by also bringing out a knight. also very good. The bishops come out. The bishop comes to c4, attacking the weak pawn, and this bishop comes out here doing the same thing. Now, if you have this position, if you have both bishops out, as white, in this instance, the weather is perfect for you to play the Evans Gambit. And here's what the Evans Gambit looks like. You move your b pawn up to b4 to attack this bishop. Remember, giving up a pawn, and the bishop takes the pawn. And then you attack the bishop again by moving c3. This pawn is protected by this pawn, and the bishop needs to back up. Now, one of the things that you notice is the pawns have cleared out this way, because instead of developing the bishop out this way, the queen and the bishop will develop on these diagonals behind this bishop to attack the king along diagonals. That's the idea. So it's not really heavy and dense in the center, but you're activating your pieces along a different straight line. So that's the kind of thing you look for. So this bishop is backed out here, and now white brings out the center pawn again. You've seen Paul Morphy do this many, many times. And e takes. Now, if you remember last week's game, we had a very similar giving up of this pawn. And you remember last week, the knight did not retake, and the knight does not retake here either. White castles to get the king to safety and to activate. Last week, we talked about the power of pieces along these center files. That's going to happen here too. We're going to have Anderson trying to control these center files as well as attacking along the diagonals. Again, the importance of looking down those straight lines to see how your pieces can attack. So he castles, and black moves d3 to release this bishop along here. Oh, sorry. My mistake. Did you notice that this was not d3? This was d6. This is d3. They push the pawn right here because the pawn, as you knew, was attacked twice. So they move the pawn down for safety. The queen does not retake. The queen comes out here to b3 in order to attack down there. We've got this lineup, which is a lineup that we saw in The Night at the Opera as well. So we've got this attack here, and so black has to do something, and they move their queen out to f6 right here to help protect that pawn. Now, remember last week, the queen comes out, is easily attacked. That's what happens here. e5, protected by the knight, attacks that queen. So the queen moves over one square to g6, lined up with the king. That lineup is going to be an important lineup here, and also along that diagonal. This rook that we castled, that we activated, moves here, lining up the rook with the king. We saw that last week as well. This is a great square for this rook right here. The knight sees that, says, I don't like that lineup because if this pawn moves up, then there's going to be an attack. So they move their knight to e7 to block that, to help protect their king and to get ready to castle. But as you'll see, black never has a chance to castle. So knight g3, this bishop comes here. So notice we have this bishop attacking the knight that just moved there, queen and the bishop attacking down here. These are the lines of attacks. And it's important to see that so that the attacks are not necessarily immediate attacks. They're not attacking something going, oh, I'm going to attack this and I'm going to take this, I'm going to attack it and I'm going to take it. Anderson is putting his pieces on nice squares that will develop into an attack. Remember, he's looking for checkmate. He's not necessarily looking just to capture pieces. So, black comes here to attack this bishop and to free up this file for the rook. Because if you'll notice, it's going to be hard for this rook to get activated, but it can get activated down here. So bishop a3 and, b5. And the queen takes, and the rook comes here and attacks the queen. So the queen moves back here to a4 because she still wants to be lining up. So we have the queen lined up with the king here. We have the rook lined up with the king here, and this rook on this very nice open file right here. This bishop comes out to B. This bishop comes back to b6 because the queen was attacking bishop b6. And the b knight comes to d2. This knight is getting activated to motivate to come over to attack on the king's side because it can't do anything right here. And right here, it's blocking its own rook. So if there was an attack on the rook, then the rook couldn't move. We want to be able to activate this rook. So the knight has to move out. Now this bishop comes to b7. And again, thinking still about this diagonal. This bishop is planning that eventually these knights might move and it'll be attacking here where the queen is attacking. Again, this is planning ahead. They're thinking ahead of what's going to happen, putting their bishops on good squares. Now remember, this knight was going someplace else. It came here, but it still wanted to go up to attack. So it's coming here. It's going to move out, knight e4. Okay, it's coming down here. Knight e4 is planning an attack, and I'll show you what it does in just a minute. Okay, knight e4, queen goes to f5 here. Now the bishop takes. Now, the bishop here is lined up with the queen, so that if this knight moves to here to check the king, it would be checking and discovering an attack on the queen. That's the kind of thinking ahead that Anderson is doing. He's planning these attacks, using his pieces together. So the knight moving here would be check, the knight moving here would be attacking the queen, and the bishop would also be attacking the queen, but the queen couldn't move because it would be a discovered attack and check. So the queen moves now. The queen moves now so that she won't be subject to that, and she moves here to h5, still trying to keep pressure on that knight there. And this knight comes anyway and says check to the king, forking the king and the queen. And this pawn takes, which was expected, and e takes. Now notice this lineup that we've been waiting for. This rook came on this file long ago, and now when that pawn took, it pinned the knight, it discovered the pin, and the pawn is now attacking the knight. The knight is somewhat protected there. So this rook now comes over here to that open file, lining up with the king and now pinning this pawn. Okay, so we have this rook lined up the king here, pinning the knight, this rook lined up here, pinning the pawn to the king. And now this rook that we moved the knight so it could move, now we have this rook here. We've got these two rooks on these center files. We've got the bishop and the queen, and the bishop's attacking down here. Now, these pieces look like they're far away from the king, but they're going to be key in the attack that's going to be happen in just a moment. Black takes this knight, and this pawn cannot retake because the pawn is pinned. This is where some of the exciting things happen, okay? So notice that right now, Black has checkmate in one move. Do you see that? The rook is attacking, and if the queen takes this pawn, that will be checkmate. But Anderson, playing the white pieces, he has now put all his pieces exactly where he wants them to launch this famous attack. So are you ready for this? Notice that he has to check on every move, because if he does not check, it'll be checkmate. Okay, so rook takes e7, check. The king cannot retake because we have this advanced pawn right there. So the rook takes e7, check, but somebody else can take. The knight can take. Knight takes e7. Whew, black says, I got out of that. And remember, they lined up their bishop down here. So the bishop is backing up the queen on this pawn, and so is the rook. So black has this great attack. I think black thinks they're going to win. They just got out of it. They took that knight. Now we get a queen sacrifice. Queen takes d7, check. And black says, oh, great. Now I get the queen. Boom. I'm looking good. But they're not, because we have, let's see, hang on. B takes B to f5. This is not just check, this is double check. The bishop discovers a check and checks. So the queen cannot take the rook because the king would be in check by the bishop. The queen cannot take the bishop because the king would still be in check by the rook. That's the power of double check. If you're in double check, your only choice is to move your king. So we've got this double check, having lined up the rook here, having lined up the bishop here. And so the king goes to e8. And the bishop goes to d7, check, backed up by the rook. So the king cannot retake, nobody can retake, so the king moves to f8. And the bishop takes e7, checkmate. So white, even though black had checkmate and won, and white sacrificed their queen and sacrificed their rook, they managed to checkmate by having this pawn in a position where it protects this square, it protects this bishop guards this square, and this bishop checkmates the king, being backed up by this pawn right here. Isn't that a beautiful checkmate? I think that is a fabulous game, and I really understand why it's called the Evergreen Game. I recommend you watch this game numerous times because it is a little bit of a complicated game, but it is really a fun one. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you next week.